Muhammad did not have an accurate knowledge of the Gospels. I'm not sure he ever saw a New Testament book, but he was hearing things where he was, east of the Byzantine Empire, today's Iraq. That's where he is, not that far from ancient Babylonia. He's hearing stuff third hand, fourth hand. He has a very inaccurate knowledge, but he likes Jesus. He likes him. He respects Mary, Jesus' mother, and he did not like what Jewish critics were saying at the time, rabbis in the synagogue, suggesting that Mary had Jesus out of wedlock.
Right.
You know, suggesting that Jesus was a sorcerer and a false teacher. That offended Muhammad. So what he's trying to do is defend Jesus, and he's rebuking the Jewish people, but he's correcting Christians. He thinks Christians have gone over the top by thinking that Jesus is literally the Son of God. They think Christians are wrong in believing that Jesus died on the cross because God would never have allowed that to happen. So although Muhammad, I think, in a way meant well, he got it really wrong. And that's the problem. And so there's nothing in the Quran that talks about Jesus that trumps what the first century Gospels tell us about him. What historian would use a source that's 600 years removed from the events and the person when you have at hand 4 biographies within a generation or so of that person? So that's the real problem. There is no verisimilitude in the Quran. It does not match up with what we know of the first century.
What is the danger of seeing Jesus as a zealot, as Eslan claimed? What's the real danger to popular listeners, readers, and folks who might say, oh, well, maybe there's a better view of Jesus or a different view?
The danger is it guts the gospel. It just tears the heart right out of the gospel. To turn Jesus into a zealot is to turn him into a fanatic who doesn't really know what he's doing or what he's... There were lots of those.
Yeah, well, Simon the Zealot.
Oh,
right?
There were a lot of those. Josephus tells us about 6 or 7 men, at least in this period of time, who were zealots and were going to drive out the Romans and restore Israel. And they all failed. To say Jesus is one of them just takes the heart of the gospel away. That's just not right, and that's not in step with good historical methodology.
I think a lot of Christians, when they first, or maybe even people who are exploring Christianity, you know, we live in an internet age, and you can now read the Gospel of Thomas online. You can find so much information out there, and I think it's faith-shattering to a lot of people to realize that there are alternative versions of who Jesus was, and yet you've read them all as a scholar, you've studied them all. What convinces you that Jesus is who he said he is and who the early church believed him to be?
You know, having different gospels and sources to look at, I think, is actually helpful. I tell my students, you know, they'll say, oh my goodness, there are 10, 12, 15 other gospels. And I said, why don't you read them? Just do that. Read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then read these others. Almost always the student comes back and says, oh, I see what you mean. The church made no mistake. Because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John give us a coherent picture that's realistic. It fits in the time, but it isn't just realistic. The Jesus that emerges from these Gospels that's the wow factor. I know a lot of Israeli archaeologists. They're Israelis. They're not Christians.
Right.
Yet they think the New Testament Gospels are reliable, and they use them in their own work. And so they're really putting, you might say, their money where their mouth is. Okay. Because what they do is they dig where the Gospels suggest you ought to dig. They interpret what they dig up in the light of what the Gospels say. In other words, the Gospels exhibit what a historian calls verisimilitude. The Gospels exhibit the way things really were. And so they're tested and tried and proven time and time again. So that's why I think the radical skepticism in some quarters, the Jesus Seminar or whatever, is ill-informed. They don't know the land of Israel. They don't know the archaeology very well. If you do, then you recognize that the Gospels are very reliable sources.
So, I mean, when you think about what the Jesus Seminar said, they actually took the red letters and made some of them pink, and I think some of them gray and some black. And so, if I remember correctly from my readings around that, they said the black letters, Jesus never said that. And the gray, maybe he said it. Pink, might have. And then there were like just a few verses that were left red. Jesus definitely said that. But I remember reading a book by N.T. Wright, one of your colleagues, who discredited that methodology as well. So how does that play out? Like, how can we, if you've got a red letter edition of the New Testament, how do you know Jesus actually said that?
Well, we know that Jesus said the things that the Gospels said because of coherence, the way they fit together, multiple attestations. So it's not just
Right.
a single source, it's many. The sources themselves are within a generation of Jesus' own time and have credible links to people who are eyewitnesses. And if the Gospels were untrustworthy, if they were written in such a remote time that there really is no credible link, then how come they get it right? How come there is that verisimilitude I referred to a moment ago? After all, we have fictional texts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Gnostic Gospels, for example.
Gospel of Thomas.
They never get it right. And see, that's the thing. I don't know any archaeologist in Israel who uses the Gospel of Thomas or one of the Gnostic Gospels. Nobody does, because they don't help the historian or the archaeologist do his work. They all cite Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts to know where to dig and how to interpret what they dig up. That tells me a lot. And that's why, for a lot of other reasons too, I think the New Testament Gospels should be trusted.
Right. So some of the historians who study this thing also say, well, maybe archaeologically it's accurate, and I certainly buy what you're saying and would agree with that. But some people would say, well, that's true, but wasn't the Gospels, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, weren't they written by followers of Jesus who elevated Jesus' claim to divinity? In other words, kind of like what Aslan said. Jesus was just a guy, a zealot, who was a wise teacher, but he wasn't really God. He wasn't who he said he was. Can you deduce that from the gospel when the gospel was written by followers of him, or how does that work?
Well, the Gospels are written by Christians, of course. Who else would write them? We wouldn't expect pagans to write the Gospels. They're written by Jewish followers of Jesus who are committed to Jesus. But Jesus taught his own disciples to be truthful.
Right.
Let's not forget that. There's a commitment to truth. But as Jewish followers of Jesus, they already have in place a coherent and accurate understanding of God. They've got the scriptures of Israel. So there's already a heritage that is meaningful. Why do they need to tweak it unless there's a really good reason for it? And of course, it's the resurrection.
Yes.
And the resurrection puts it into a whole new level. And so they're blown away by that. They have something to proclaim. And so there isn't any need to exaggerate. How do you top that? Jesus has been raised from the dead. That's what they proclaim. And that's the key doctrine. And the rest of it is like commentary that explains the outworking, the everyday living of it. Jesus is teaching then. And so there is no need to, why embellish?
Yeah.
You know, that's the top element. And so just tell the truth.